You probably know the old optical illusion that starts with an image like this and says, oh, look, it's a duck, until you turn it on its head and now it's a rabbit. Turns out, the way different voices recognize or understand the cross of Jesus is like one of those moments. The empire takes a look at the way it crucifies Jesus and thinks, look, this proves we're victorious, we've crushed him. And the Christian community takes a look at Jesus and at the cross and goes, no, this proves Jesus is the victor. He outlasted and endured all the worst the powers of evil could do to him. That's where we're headed in this session of Meeting Jesus. So as we've been working our way through the gospel according to Mark, we've noticed there's this ongoing struggle, this conflict between Jesus' way of embodying the reign of God, Jesus' way of being the Messiah, and everybody else's expectation. And the heart of that conflict is that just about everybody else, whether they are Romans or faithful, devout Jews, or anybody in between on the spectrum, has gotten into their system, gotten into their mind this idea that the Messiah is going to be a conquering king, a military general cut out of the mold of every emperor or king that they've seen before, right? The conquerors like the Babylonians or the Egyptians or the Assyrians or now the Romans, or even a military conqueror like King David was remembered to be in Israel's history. And Jesus has at every point along the way insisted, that's not what I've come for. That's not how God chooses to save the world. Ultimately, what we need is not someone to build a new empire. What we need is someone whose love is willing to endure all the worst that humanity can endure and inflict, and break the power of death itself through suffering love. Jesus has said earlier, the Son of Man, this is his title for himself, comes not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many, right? At the heart of who Jesus is a fundamental turning on its head of people's expectations of what the Messiah is supposed to be and how he does that. That's even clearer when you get to the scenes finally we've arrived at in chapter 15 of Mark's Gospel, as Jesus is finally brought on trial before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. The opening scene has Jesus, after he's sort of gone through an interrogation by the religious leaders, the priests, the scribes, the religious class. They now bring him in front of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. And the first question Pilate asks is, are you the king of the Jews? It's interesting, the charges that matter to the different people holding trial for Jesus. When it was the religious leaders, their question is, do you call yourself the Son of the Blessed One? And related to that, are you the Messiah, right? And there's sort of these religious connotations. And ultimately, when Jesus claims an association with God, when Jesus claims not to be just a random ordinary guy, but to be God's own embodied Son, that's what upsets them. And they say the charge is blasphemy, right? Profaning God's name and reputation. Rome doesn't particularly care about religious qualms. Rome doesn't really care who you worship. You could call yourself a poached egg if you want. Rome is more concerned with what it sees as threats to its power. So the question that Pilate asks is, are you the king of the Jews? And Pilate, you can kind of tell, sees this as a win-win, right? That if Jesus is serious and legitimate here, this is a chance to squelch and to crush a potential usurper, somebody who might potentially raise up an army, a militia of people who are looking to fight off the Romans. And if he isn't like that, but he can get that title to stick king of the Jews, then he can crush Jesus and sort of show this is what we do to anybody. This is what we think of you. Pilate here isn't a hero. And I think it becomes even clearer as the trial goes on. Jesus doesn't say anything to Pilate's question other than just, you say so, right? Are you the king of the Jews? Well, you say so. Almost like that's how you would translate it. That's how your mind would think of it, but that's not the right way to talk about me. But that's how you would say it. Okay, fine. But Jesus also insists he never quite gives into the world's expectations that he be a conquering king, a military hero, a political presence like that. And after that, Jesus doesn't say anything. Now, when Pilate doesn't quite know what to make of Jesus, he invokes that tradition that apparently the gospel writers are aware of, where the Romans would free a political prisoner around the time of the Passover. Right? Passover is the celebration in ancient Israel's history of political freedom, right? Of liberation from Pharaoh's Egypt. And if you are the dominating empire at the time, you don't want to let people go crazy and think they might all be free of the empire, but you want to give them a little bit of breathing room, right? If you give them a treat, you can distract them with the fact that your boot is on their neck, right? So the empire here, we'll throw you a bone, we'll give you a political prisoner, and the crowd isn't interested in Jesus. Rather, Mark says instead they want him to release Barabbas. This guy who was in prison, and as Mark says, was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during an insurrection, right? People who had tried to violently overthrow the Roman Empire and killed people along the way. It's interesting, the parallels between Jesus and Barabbas. Barabbas is an Aramaic title name that means son of the Father. And here Jesus has gone along throughout the whole Gospel of Mark. Mark has tried to identify Jesus as the Son of God the Father, right? So that there's this sort of parallel between the two of them. In Matthew's Gospel, in fact, he even gives Barabbas' first name as Jesus. So there are two Jesuses on trial, and the question is which one will be released. In any case, there's this question of how you deal with empire, right? Barabbas' response is we fight fire with fire. We got to kill our enemies, and it doesn't matter who else is collateral damage along the way. We're overthrowing the Romans, and anybody who gets in our way, sorry, they might die too. And Jesus' way, which again overturns expectations, Jesus responds to the power of empire. Jesus responds to the power of Rome, not by killing his enemies, but by being willing to absorb even the worst they can inflict on him. Jesus' silence is not to say, boy, it's going to be great to be killed, but to say, my way of dealing with evil is to absorb it all the way to the full and break its power from the inside out. Rome can't understand that, and for that matter, the followers who are crying for Barabbas to be released can't understand it either. So eventually, they do release Barabbas, and Pilate says he doesn't understand what evil Jesus has done, but when the crowd cries out all the more, crucify him, Barabbas just does what's politically expedient. He releases Barabbas, flogs Jesus, right? That's sort of having him whipped with his brutal Roman whip, and hands him over to be crucified. Now, there have been some over the last 20 centuries of Christian history who would use that moment to sort of let Pilate off the hook. Oh, look, Pilate, he didn't even think Jesus was guilty. It's all those other mean religious people in the crowd. But think about what an indictment it is of Roman justice. That Pilate clearly doesn't think Jesus is worthy of death, that he's done something that is a capital crime, but realizes that it's easier for crowd control to get rid of Jesus and is willing to have him tortured first, flogged, and then crucified because he doesn't really care about doing justice. This story, the story of Jesus' crucifixion, isn't really about letting Pilate or the Romans off the hook and blaming the religious people. It's rather to say, in a sense, everybody's got blood on their hands, right? The religious people think the way to get rid of Jesus is we should hand him over to the Romans because Jesus doesn't fit their expectations of the Messiah. Rome doesn't care at all about this Messiah business. It sees a potential threat and somebody who could be getting in the way of their rule, getting in the way of their domination, and they want to get rid of him, whether or not he's guilty, whether or not he's worthy of death. At least the religious leaders have a charge that it makes sense that Jesus is guilty of. He said things that only God or God's Messiah is allowed to do, and Jesus doesn't look like their expectation of Messiah, so therefore they have to get rid of him. Pilate doesn't care. Pilate is just willing to do what's expedient. So nobody here comes off smelling like a rose except Jesus, who constantly refuses to return evil for evil. Jesus, who doesn't play either the power games of the religious leaders, and certainly doesn't play the power games of Pilate and the empire. The soldiers then, once they have custody of Jesus, do things that are intended to mock Jesus, right? To sort of play up this king business, right? So they strip him of his clothes, they weave some of the thorns into a crown and jam it on its head. They strike him on the head, and as they're doing that, bow down and mock him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And the whole point is not just to mock Jesus, but to mock the whole people that Jesus represents. If they can do this to the quote-unquote king of the Jews, it's a way to put everybody else in line, all those other Jewish people watching this happen, as a way of saying, this is what we do to your king, so you better be careful. This is what we do to you. In other words, nobody is piously defending, we're really concerned about somebody inappropriately claiming title of king of the Jews, and this is a crime that should be rightly punished. It's a bullying tactic, right? It's Rome saying, we need to intimidate everybody so that nobody steps out of line. As they're leading Jesus to the cross, there's this really interesting and deeply human moment that Mark gives us. They compel somebody standing in the crowd to carry the cross because apparently at this point Jesus is so weak and injured, he can't carry it by himself. So it was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, what I love about that little detail is we never hear about this Alexander and Rufus, or even for that matter, Simon of Cyrene, ever again. And yet Mark thought it was important enough to say, hey, you know the guy who carried Jesus' cross? He was the father of people named Alexander and Rufus. What that tells me, what that says to us, is in the lived community where Mark's gospel was written and read, Alexander and Rufus were people they knew. Here was somebody that had a first-hand, second-hand connection to the actual story of Jesus. And that Mark, when he's writing, pictures that Alexander and Rufus are in the congregation where he's telling his story about Jesus, and it's almost as if to say, this isn't a fable I made up. You know the people who were connected to this story. You know, Alex and Rufus, we grew up with them, right? Those guys who sit in the seats next to you in worship, those guys, their dad was the one who carried the cross for Jesus. It is this deeply human moment that reminds us the story of Jesus' death and resurrection isn't a myth like the stories of Zeus or Apollo or Marduk, pick your pantheon in ancient cultures. The story of Jesus as presented is here's God's entering into history in a unique way. And in particular, that God has come in Jesus all the way to death, even death on a cross, and that actual lived people touched that life. That's a big deal. The final scene then that we'll talk about this time has Jesus up on the cross crucified, and the inscription says, the King of the Jews is the charge that's put on him. And as Mark tells it, both of the criminals who are crucified with Jesus are mocking him, while also the people who are walking past are mocking Jesus and saying, you said you could destroy the temple and build it up in 3 days, so save yourself and come down from the cross. Those who are crucified with Jesus, the religious leaders and the crowds, everybody watching, everybody is mocking Jesus. And again, for all of them, they read this moment one way. They say, oh, here's this schlub Jesus. The empire has killed him. Look what they did to him. This proves the empire is right. They're more powerful. Might makes right. They're the winners. This is Rome's victory over Jesus. The Christian community for 2,000 years has read this story differently and said, no, you completely misunderstand. You thought it was a duck and it turned out to be a rabbit. Look at how Jesus bears all of this rottenness, all this hate, all this violence, all this mockery, and Jesus absorbs it into himself and doesn't return evil for evil, doesn't die cursing his enemies or crushing his enemies or crucifying his enemies. Jesus' kind of victory is that he's willing to be crucified, to lay down his life, in Jesus' own words, like a ransom for many, rather than to destroy or kill or respond with evil for evil. This is Jesus' kind of victory. And if we believe Mark, this is God's kind of victory. Next time, we're going to take a look at the rest of the story of the death and burial of Jesus. And then one more session after that, we'll take a look at Mark's resurrection account in Mark 16. Throughout the rest of these weeks, as we keep finishing up the Gospel of Mark, we keep inviting you to join us for in-person conversation and study, 1 o'clock on Thursdays here at Community of Christ, or you can catch up with these video sessions too. See you along the way.